Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we re-wandering far from the noise of the modern world into an age where every challenge was met with steel, armor, and courage. The era of medieval knights. But before you settle in, take a slow breath, let your shoulders drop. And if my voice is already starting to soften the edges of your day, then feel free to gently like the video. And subscribe only if being here truly feels good to you. Now, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It always amazes me how people from every corner of the world end up sharing this quiet little moment together. So go ahead, dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that soft, steady hum. Let the room sink into calm, and as your mind begins to unwind, let's step into tonight's journey, side by side, into armor, shadows, and ancient legends. If medieval swords really worked the way movies claim, every knight would have walked onto the battlefield, smiling, confident, and probably humming a heroic theme song. Instead, most of them walked in thinking, if this sword is the only thing standing between me and death today, then I deeply regret every decision that brought me here. Because here's the uncomfortable truth, and it hits harder the more you think about it. The sword wasn't the hero. It wasn't even the side character. It was the last thing you grab before you start praying. A knight drawing his sword wasn't a sign of glory. It was a sign that everything had fallen apart. The lance splintered, the spear snapped in half, the shield trampled somewhere behind him, swallowed by mud and chaos. And now he's standing alone, drenched in sweat and fear, gripping 3 pounds of metal, like, ah, yes, Plan Z, fantastic. In movies, sword fights glide across the screen like a violent ballet. In reality, they looked like 2 exhausted construction workers yelling at each other while swinging crowbars. No elegance, no choreography, just survival. Plate armor didn't slice open politely when struck. It ignored your hopes, dreams, and entire life story. Swinging a sword at plate was like knocking on the gates of a fortress that absolutely refused to open. Knights knew this. That's why they didn't waste energy slicing. They hunted for the vulnerable places, the weak spots armor couldn't guard, the armpit, the elbow gaps, the throat openings, and the one awful little groin flap that medieval artists politely pretended didn't exist. Medieval combat manuals, not romantic at all, just depressing catalogs of here are the places where you can stab a man and ruin everything he cares about. And then there was half-swording, one of the most effective, unglamorous, emotionally devastating techniques ever invented. Picture this: a knight grabs his own blade with a gloved hand, turning his sword into a short spear. Yes, he holds the blade. No, his fingers don't fall off. Despite what fantasy novels want you to believe, medieval swords weren't enchanted laser razors. They were sharp, dangerously sharp, but not instantly remove your hand sharp. And thank the heavens for that, because knights were gripping them like they were trying to choke the sword into obeying. Half-swording wasn't about style. It was about precision, desperation, and the terrifying calm that comes when a man realizes he has no other options left. You weren't swinging anymore. You were guiding a point toward a tiny gap while someone tried to kill you with equal enthusiasm. This was surgery performed inside a metal coffin. Combat manuals from the 1400s showed knights ramming blades into armpits, prying open visors, and smashing pommels into helmets like they were trying to fix a medieval printer with unfiltered rage. Because battlefields were not cinematic, they were bleak. mud, blood, screams, metal, and exhaustion. Swinging wildly for hours would turn your arms into trembling ropes. Half-swording was survival, brutal, intimate, efficient, but you'll never see it in movies. Because the moment an actor grabs the blade, half the audience would choke on their popcorn screaming, he'd cut his hand off. While real knights from the past collectively sigh. If swords were the polite handshake of medieval combat, maces were the aggressive, bone-crushing greeting that said, "Hello, I would like you to stop existing." Knights didn't carry maces to look cool. They carried them because armor made swords feel like toys. A sword could impress. A mace could terrify. A mace didn't slice. It didn't stab. It delivered pure, merciless physics. One good hit. Medieval chronicles described these injuries as significant, which is the historian version of saying, he was turned into medieval origami. Training with a sword took years. Training with a mace took 30 seconds. Lift, swing, repeat until your enemy reconsiders his life choices. Then came the warhammer. Not the fantasy monster-sized versions carried by shirtless giants, but the real ones, compact, focused, built with the cold logic of someone who studied plate armor and said, I know exactly how to ruin this. A warhammer wasn't dramatic. It wasn't beautiful. It was the weapon you picked when the battlefield stopped being a place of glory and became a place of fear. And it was perfectly engineered for ruining your opponent's afternoon. They typically had two ends, a blunt hammer face for delivering the kind of impact that makes a man reconsider his place in the universe, and a narrow, vicious spike designed to punch through armor joints like someone opening a tin can with misplaced enthusiasm. If plate armor was a fortress, then the warhammer was just a weapon. It was a portable siege engine fueled by terror, adrenaline, and sheer medieval spite. Let's talk about that spike. It wasn't decorative, symbolic, or artistic. It was the quiet nightmare forged by blacksmiths who understood one universal truth. If you gather all the force of a galloping horse, a desperate knight, and the raw panic of survival, and channel it into one sharpened point, something catastrophic will happen. A good hit didn't bounce harmlessly like a sword. No cinematic deflection, no dramatic sparks. It dug in, it pierced, it ended things. Helmet pierced, breastplate cracked, spine interrupted. You didn't need a beautiful swing or a dramatic arc, just one short, ugly, furious jab into a visor slit, and the fight was over. Not for the moment, forever. Medieval combat manuals didn't glorify warhammers. They didn't need poetry. The subtext was chillingly simple. Aim here, they will not survive. And unlike axes, which loved getting stuck inside whatever unfortunate thing they hit, warhammers slid in and out with unsettling, almost disappointing ease, perfect for warriors who valued three things: speed, accuracy, and not dying today. Hollywood avoids warhammers because they don't look heroic. There is nothing cinematic about calmly puncturing someone's helmet like you retesting a melon at the market. But historically, warhammers were the great equalizers, small enough to ignore, powerful enough to regret ignoring. If swords were the polite handshake of medieval combat, axes were the part of the arsenal that said, I'm not here to impress. I'm here to ruin someone's week. And yes, knights absolutely used axes. Not the lumberjack kind from hardware stores, but purpose-built combat axes, light, fast, and shaped with the kind of aggressive energy that suggests the weapon designer needed therapy. Medieval axes weren't massive bricks of metal. They were ruthless precision tools, forged by people who clearly had unresolved feelings about shields, helmets, and the concept of mercy. One good swing, backed by armor, fury, and momentum, and something broke, and it was never something good. But axes weren't just tools of destruction. They were multi-purpose chaos generators, with the bearded hook on the back. A knight could yank shields aside, drag enemies off horses, pull a man close enough to make regrettable life decisions unavoidable. Imagine riding confidently into battle, armored and proud, only to feel a hook latch onto your shield like a medieval tow truck. In one horrifying second, your heroic charge becomes a clumsy, face-first introduction to the ground. Axis also had one more specialty: destroying wood, shields, spear, shafts, barricades, doors. If it was made of wood, an axe treated it like a personal insult. They were cheap, durable, and terrifyingly effective. Even peasants carried them, much to the dismay of historians trying to maintain the illusion of noble weapon hierarchies. But the real reason knights loved axes: they worked on people who really didn't want to be hit. Armor could deflect, shields could block, swords could miss, but axes found ways to make you regret wearing metal at all. Hollywood doesn't show axes because they lack elegance. Real knights didn't care. Elegance doesn't matter in a muddy field full of strangers screaming in Old French. Survival does. If swords were the celebrities of medieval weapons, glamorous, overrated, and constantly misrepresented, then spears were the underpaid background actors, silently holding the entire production together. Spears won wars. Spears formed armies. Spears shaped history. They didn't need songs or ceremonial versions. No knight rode dramatically into a hall, waving a 2-meter pointy stick. But a spear on the battlefield, it was the difference between living long enough to complain or not. Simple design, terrifying results. Spears outranged everything, while swords demanded intimate distances, close enough to smell your opponent's breath and fears. A spear let you start ruining someone's plans from 2 meters away. A knight on foot with a spear was dangerous. A knight on horseback with a lance was a medieval missile. A lance strike carried enough force to break ribs, unhorse riders, and occasionally send a man airborne in ways gravity did not approve of. Some knights fell so hard it felt like their descendants would feel the impact centuries later. Even peasants could use spears effectively. Training was simple: pointy end toward enemy. Repeat. Spears formed walls, forests of death where cavalry charges went to die. Shield walls, pike blocks, all terrifying because of one simple thing: a lot of sharp sticks pointed in the same direction. And maintenance. A sword needed love and polishing. A spear needed a stick, maybe a new metal tip if you had an especially dramatic year. They were the IKEA furniture of medieval warfare: cheap, functional, and surprisingly durable. Hollywood avoids spears because real spear fights end too fast, too efficient, too real. No spinning, flipping, or 15-minute sword duels. Just one precise thrust, and the scene is over. Knights knew the truth. If you wanted to stay alive, you prayed that your sword remained in its sheath, and your spear never left your hands. Which brings us to jousting. Hollywood paints it as majestic: 2 noble knights, slow motion, sunlit lances, heroic music swelling. Reality. Jousting was the medieval version of participating in a high-speed demolition derby while wearing a metal oven. A lance charge was a controlled car crash powered by terror, galloping horses, and questionable life choices. A knight would lower his lance, grip tightly, pray to every saint, and hope the opposing knight didn't have better aim. The faster you rode, the harder you hit, and the harder you risked being launched off your horse like a sack of flour fired from a trebuchet. Hollywood lances splintering dramatically. That part is actually true. They were designed to break, because if they didn't, every joust would end with someone losing their head, literally. But that was in tournaments, on a clean field, with cheering nobles and medical staff waiting nearby. On an actual battlefield, not a tidy tournament field with cheering nobles, lances were even more chaotic. The ground wasn't just uneven. It felt like the earth itself was trying to throw you off balance. Dust clung to your lungs, your eyes, your thoughts, and the person charging at you, he wasn't acting, he wasn't performing, he wasn't pretending. He was genuinely, sincerely, violently committed to ending your existence before you ended his. Nothing about this was graceful. Nothing was rehearsed. It was 2 armored missiles, each strapped to a desperate man, hurtling toward each other with sharpened tree trunks aimed at the heart. If your lance landed perfectly, maybe, just maybe, your opponent would tumble, ribs cracking, breath gone, spirit shattered. If you misjudged by even a whisper, you'd lose everything at once: control, pride, oxygen, and possibly your last meal. Knights toppled, skid across the dirt, flailed on their backs like furious iron beetles, scrambling up before someone noticed and turned them into the tragic footnote historians barely bother to write. And when the lance splintered, which it did constantly, like the universe was made of cheap wood, the knight didn't hesitate. He ditched it instantly, grabbing anything with an edge or a point: swords, maces, axes, whatever his hand found in the chaos. Lances were never meant to last. They were single-shot declarations of violence. One hit, one chance, no second attempt. Yet despite their temporary nature, everyone feared them. A well-timed lance charge could slice through a formation like lightning tearing a tree apart. Infantry scattered, lines broke, screams rose. Lances weren't dueling tools. They were medieval shockwaves. If swords were for pride and axes for emergencies, the lance was the way you announced, loudly and aggressively, "Brace yourself, I'm coming." And if medieval weapons were household items, then the poleaxe was that unhinged, overbuilt monstrosity your uncle keeps in the corner. Too many functions, 0 safety instructions, and definitely not legal in your country. Knights adored poleaxes because they offered every method imaginable for ruining someone's day in one neat, terrifying package. Let's break it down. A poleaxe wasn't a simple axonistic. No medieval weapon makers looked at an axe and said, "What if we made it worse?" They added a hammer on one side, a vicious spike on top that practically radiated childhood trauma, and wrapped the whole shaft in metal so it wouldn't explode during heated arguments. The final creation, a tool that could chop, smash, stab, drag, puncture, pry, and probably open stubborn containers if necessary. If the warhammer was a can opener, the poleaxe was the entire hardware aisle. Hollywood avoids poleaxes because they're too real. Real poleaxe combat wasn't pretty. It wasn't elegant. It looked like 2 armored construction workers having a nervous breakdown inside a medieval Home Depot, testing each other's helmets for warranty coverage. And yes, knights actually used them in tournaments. Imagine two heavily armored men enthusiastically attempting to apply physics to each other's skulls, while the audience politely applauds. The surviving manuals offer techniques such as hit the head, hit the body, hit whatever presents itself. Not exactly comforting advice. On the battlefield, poleaxes leveled everything. Mail, plate, no armor, too much armor, didn't matter. The hammer face crushed steel like it was overripe fruit. The axe blade split shields and bones with equal frustration. And the spike, that horrible, judgmental spike, it sought out the one unfortunate gap in your armor, like it was personally offended by your existence. They were also grappling tools. Knights used the hooks to yank enemies down, pull shields wide open, or drag someone directly into stabbing range. If a poleaxe hooked you, congratulations. You just became the unwilling contestant in a medieval wrestling match, where your opponent wielded a giant mechanized nightmare. Yet despite the brutality, poleaxes were surprisingly refined. Not visually, they looked like a war crime, but mechanically. Every piece had a purpose. Every motion was economical. No wasted movement. Just pure, cold, medieval logic. If swords were the poetry of war, poleaxes were the engineering. And in a world full of sweat, armor, and people determined to eliminate each other, engineering usually won. If the sword was a knight's symbol of honor, and the poleaxe his "I'm officially done being nice" tool, then the dagger was the "this just got personal" solution. Daggers weren't flashy, they didn't glitter, didn't boast heroic names, didn't care about drama. They were small, plain, brutally sincere, a perfect reflection of medieval life. Knights didn't carry daggers to impress. They carried them because every epic battle eventually collapsed into two armored men, rolling in the mud like enraged turtles, fighting over their last breath. And in that suffocating steel hug, you didn't swing a sword. You reached for something that slid straight into the vulnerable seams. The armpit, the visor, the neck opening, the groin, the elbow gap. All the places armor designers wished they could have covered, but didn't unless they wanted the wearer to pass out before lunch. Real medieval daggers weren't the oversized, glamorous movie props wielded backward by actors pretending they know what they're doing. They were short, rigid, terrifyingly matter-of-fact. A knight didn't want to slash. He wanted to insert the blade into a very specific location and make the other man regret showing up today. One of the most infamous designs was the rondel dagger, a rigid triangular spike that looked like it belonged in a carpenter's toolbox. Perfect for slipping into armor gaps and shutting down someone's entire lineage. The medieval precision screwdriver. If screwdrivers were invented to end family trees, combat manuscripts show knights wrestling, pinning, and driving daggers downward through visors with the same energy you'd use to force open a stubborn jar. Except the consequences were much, much worse. No elegance, no cinematic choreography, just intent, raw, sincere, terrifying intent. But daggers weren't just for killing. They were utility tools. Knights cut rope, fixed armor, prepared food, whittled wood, and even performed makeshift surgery with them. Yes, the same dagger used to end someone's story could also remove an arrowhead or slice an apple. Medieval multitasking at its darkest. Hollywood ignores them because they don't sparkle. But ask any knight, the dagger was often the final punctuation mark in a very violent sentence. If swords were the celebrities and maces were the problem solvers, then shields were the burnt-out office workers keeping everything together. Shields didn't exist for aesthetics. They existed for survival. And survival was shockingly difficult when the world was actively trying to eliminate you. A shield wasn't just wood. It was layers of timber, hide, glue, metal, and paint that probably dried slower than the knight expected to stay alive. Shields weren't walls. They were mobile fortresses. Movies show shields politely blocking neat, staged strikes. Reality, shields were weapons. Knights punched, slammed, smashed, rammed, and bulldozed with them. Imagine an armored man sprinting toward you with a portable wooden wall strapped to his arm. That S-shield combat. A good shield bash could knock the wind out of your soul, break teeth, flip you over, or take you out of the fight before a sword ever touched you. Knights also used the edges like angry metal bookends, striking sideways with enough force to collapse ribs and make someone forget their own name. And then the shapes, each a different purpose. Kite shields for riders, heaters for speed, round shields for smashing the nearest Viking in the face, if you ever had the misfortune of ending up in Scandinavia. Shields were also command centers. Knights painted their shields with bright emblems, not for aesthetics or dramatic effect, but for survival, because in a battlefield packed with armored lookalikes smashing into one another like metal storm clouds, that bold golden lion wasn't decoration. It was a desperate signal to your allies, screaming, "I'm with you, don't hit me." But shields lived short, brutal lives. A single vicious axe strike could snap one apart, leaving the knight clutching what amounted to an expensive wooden tragedy shaped like a broken slice of sadness. And that was the whole idea. Better the shield die than the man behind it. In the grand theater of war, the shield wasn't glamorous. It wasn't praised. It was the overworked employee doing every dreadful task while the sword got all the fame. And if you imagine medieval combat as two noble warriors exchanging poetic sword strokes while wind machines blow their hair back, I'm afraid you've fallen victim to fantasy shampoo commercial logic. Real knightly combat often devolved into two armored beasts rolling in the mud, furious and filthy, like enraged armadillos arguing about rent. Because, yes, knights grappled. More than you'd ever expect from people wrapped in 60 pounds of metal, trying to uphold their respectable public image. Grappling wasn't a last-ditch move. It was core curriculum. The old fighting manuals, written by men who clearly enjoyed drawing armored people collapsing, are filled with throws, tackles, chokeholds, leg sweeps, and polite instructions for rearranging an opponent's skeleton while maintaining eye contact. There are delightful sketches of knights flipping each other upside down like circus performers who severely misread the job description. The logic behind all of it was painfully simple. Once you're close enough to grab a man, your sword becomes about as effective as swinging a loaf of bread. Knights closed the distance, seized armor plates, twisted limbs, hooked ankles, and sent each other crashing into the earth with enough violence to make modern wrestlers reconsider their passion. And because armor absorbed so much damage, they could go Ellen without immediately dying, meaning grappling matches were chaotic, brutal, and profoundly undignified. The objective: get the other man on the ground. Once he's down, gravity becomes your personal executioner. And when he's finally pinned, you move to the part of combat no medieval mother wanted to acknowledge, the dagger. While the defeated knight lay helpless, flailing like an overturned beetle, the victor planted a knee on his chest, drew a rondel dagger, and began searching the armor for a weak point, because the only thing between that blade and something vital was a sliver of steel and wishful thinking. Grappling also helped strip weapons away, break grips, or simply exhaust an enemy until he collapsed from sheer misery. Sometimes knights wrestled because their swords lodged in armor. Sometimes because the battlefield was too chaotic to swing. Sometimes because the mud betrayed them and they slipped like tragic slapstick actors in a medieval comedy routine. Battles were full of this: mud, blood, sweat, chaos. Knights fell constantly. Hollywood will never show Sir Sparkleblade face planting into a puddle before body slamming an opponent, but real knights, they lived that reality. When everything else failed, you grabbed the nearest enemy and threw him to the ground like he was a sack of medieval groceries. If knights possessed one true advantage, it wasn't their ideals or manners, it was their armor. Armor was their mobile bank vault, their walking insurance plan, their "please let today not be my final chapter" outfit. And unlike the stiff tin cans Hollywood loves to portray, real armor was shockingly agile. Knights could sprint, climb, leap, tumble, and even dance, though not attractively, to be perfectly clear. Armor had one purpose: keep its owner alive long enough to complain afterward. Mail stopped cuts. Plate stopped nearly everything except falls, taxes, and sarcasm. In full plate, a knight was a medieval tank, stubbornly hard to kill. And contrary to popular myth, armor wasn't impossibly heavy. A full suit weighed around 40 to 60 pounds, about the same as modern military gear. And it wasn't dangling from the shoulders like a cursed gym challenge. It was distributed across the body, making it surprisingly manageable. Knights didn't shuffle, they aggressively strutted. The real weakness wasn't movement, it was heat. Wearing plate in a battle was like climbing into a steel oven set to sweaty despair. Inside the helmet was a sauna with bad ventilation, zero comfort, and a constant risk of someone stabbing through the opening. Knights had to choose between lifting the visor to breathe or keeping it down so they didn't get an unsolicited ventilation hole through the skull. Armor made fights longer, too. Blows that would have liquefied an unarmored peasant simply bounced off with a resonant bonk that meant I lived. But now I'm irritated. This forced weapons to evolve into brutality. Hammers, maces, poleaxes, anything capable of turning dents into pain. But armor wasn't flawless. Gaps existed: armpits, elbows, groins, all the areas no one wants a blade. These tiny weaknesses became prime targets for spikes and daggers. Knights trusted their armor, but they also lived with the constant fear that one unlucky jab could ruin their entire calendar. So yes, armor was incredible, a masterpiece of survival engineering. But it was hot, exhausting, and occasionally humiliating when a fully armed knight toppled into the mud and needed a friend to haul him upright like an overturned iron turtle. If films were honest, battles would be less majestic poetry and more absolute, swirling chaos. Picture thousands of men smashing together like a metal avalanche in a collapsing barn. The idea of a respectful one-on-one duel, hilarious. On a real battlefield, if you paused to introduce yourself, 10 strangers would rush over to stab you before you finished your dramatic speech. Medieval combat was not fair. It wasn't tidy. It wasn't glorious. It was a filthy, crowded brawl where the only rule was, don't kill the guy wearing your team's colors. Helmets restricted vision to miserable slits. Smoke and dust blocked everything else. Half the time, knights didn't know who they were hitting. They swung, hoped, and prayed it wasn't family. The ground was a disaster. Mud, broken weapons, loose stones, the perfect recipe for constant, embarrassing falls. Watching a knight collapse in full armor was like seeing a refrigerator attempt yoga. Getting back up wasn't any prettier. And while he flailed helplessly, someone usually introduced their mace directly to his helmet. Lines shattered instantly. Infantry collided. Horses crashed through everyone. Archers fired into the chaos, and sometimes hit their own allies. Commanders screamed. No one listened. It was a miracle anyone survived at all. People didn't perish in romantic duels. They died from exhaustion, dehydration, heat stroke, or getting flattened by a panicked horse having the worst day of its life. Most deaths weren't elegant. They were simply the result of a man too tired to lift his shield one more inch. Hollywood hides the truth because it's messy. The real battlefield wasn't a stage. It was a suffocating, bone-shaking nightmare where the air itself felt like it wanted you dead. Every second was a gamble, a deafening blur of steel, screams, mud, and panic. Knights didn't calmly square up for noble duels in the middle of that chaos. They clawed through it. They survived it the same way we survive Mondays, by stumbling forward, dodging catastrophe, and desperately hoping someone else was having a far worse day than you. If you've ever wondered why medieval knights carried an arsenal of weapons, here's the unsettling truth. No single weapon could save you every time. Nothing ever worked on everyone. A knight preparing for battle was in choosing a favorite blade. He was choosing how he'd tried not to die. Hollywood wants you to believe knights had a signature sword, like a personal logo. Reality: they switched weapons faster than panic sets in when your Wi-Fi dies. Every weapon had a purpose, a brutal, specific purpose. The sword, perfect for slicing through unarmored flesh, useless against someone wrapped in enough steel to look like a terrified, angry pumpkin. The mace, great for collapsing armor and possibly a rib or two. Worthless if your enemy stood even an arm's length beyond reach. The spear, brilliant for keeping danger away, until danger slipped past it, and suddenly you were holding a medieval broomstick in a world that wanted you dead. The battlefield wasn't polite. It wasn't organized. It wasn't even sane. One moment you're charging on horseback, wind roaring in your ears. The next moment your horse decides life is short and ejects you face first into a ditch full of mud, panic, and probably someone's forgotten limb. Now you need a sword, or a dagger, or emotional support. But therapy didn't exist, so dagger it is. Against plate armor, bring a hammer. Against mail, bring an axe. Against someone running away, the spear becomes your motivational tool. Against someone too close, grapple and hope your dagger finds a soft spot. Against someone bigger, stronger, and in a much better mood, run. Yes, historically accurate. Knights weren't collectors, they were strategists. Every weapon in their kit wasn't for show, it was a lifeline. A mace for crushing, a sword for stabbing, a dagger for finishing, a spear for keeping nightmares away, a warhammer for when nightmares fought back. And if medieval knights had access to flamethrowers, they would have carried them without hesitation. Weapons even depended on the terrain. Mud made long weapons a curse. Forests turned spears into liabilities. Tight lines made swords hopeless. And everything made horses nervous. Because horses have zero interest in heroism. They just don't want to die. In the end, knights didn't care about honor or elegance. They cared about whatever kept them alive long enough to complain about the next battle. Movies give them one iconic blade, History gave them a shopping list. The elegant, noble knight we imagine today is a fantasy painted by artists who never smelled a battlefield. The real knight was a bruised, battered athlete of violence, a tactical survivor trapped inside a boiling metal shell. Life for a knight was 20% training, 10% fighting, and 70% regretting both. Training meant swinging heavy weapons for hours, sprinting in armor, wrestling a horse that hated your goals, and practicing moves that required the balance of a dancer and the patience of someone who no longer feared death, all while wearing layers of padding and steel that turned you into a human pressure cooker. Knights weren't bodybuilder strong, they were survival strong, the kind of strength forged by necessity and fear, not gym mirrors. On the battlefield, they weren't graceful, they were calculating, constantly judging distance, angle, timing. Every decision could save your life or end it. When to charge, when to fall back, when to grapple, when to switch weapons, when to retreat, when to scream for help because your foot got stuck in somebody else's bad day. They understood leverage, momentum, weight, armor, weak points. They knew exactly which move gave them a chance at seeing tomorrow, and which move guaranteed they'd become the day's most embarrassing cautionary tale. And through all of this, one thing never stopped: the sweat. Winter didn't stop it. Shade didn't stop it. Training, marching, fighting, breathing, everything made them sweat. Their padding probably smelled like a mixture of wet dog, regret, and old food dreams. But still, they endured. Because knights weren't mythical heroes. They were gritty, stubborn problem solvers, wrapped in 60 pounds of metal, swinging whatever tool kept death one step further away. And yes, he was always sweaty.